Trigger warning. This story deals with suicide and themes of mental illness and grief. If you or someone you know is struggling, please seek help from local resources or crisis lines. The following contains references to self-harm, but does not describe methods or sensationalize tragedy. They sealed this cave for a reason. An old black and white photograph sat on the mantel like an accusation. Councilmen in stiff jackets, a long table, a stamped envelope labeled Forest Road, closure, with the corner creased as if someone had folded it in haste. Behind them, beyond the window, the power poles marched out of town and dissolved into scrub. The caption on the back, faded ink, a hand that had trembled, said only 1980. The garden club met the next week, as it always did. Tea, trimmed hedges, and a gossip that pretended to be civic care. Bonnie brought lemon squares. Larry brought his own silence, which had settled across his face like a weathered tarp. They lit candles for the summer solstice and pretended that lighting a wick could change the law of things. Between bites of pastry, Helen Foster came up. "Helen?" said Bonnie. Her voice was softer, as if touching a bruise. "That's old trouble. Folks still talk," Larry finished. "It's a story that lives under our feet. We put it down and it pushes back." Nobody said the word curse. No one needed to. The name did a lot of work. Helen Foster, sometimes Elena, sometimes Ellen, the edges of her name worn by tellings, was both woman and story. A mother who loved too loudly, a woman who burned through the rules and then paid the price. A century had turned the details into rumor, homicide, vengeance, a child named Mary who vanished, and those rumors had the stubborn life of weeds. The club, which mostly met to exchange cuttings and gossip, let the conversation thin into the kind that circles a hole. "We had a council meeting about that place," said Bonnie, more to herself than to anyone else. "Back in 1980, I heard. They closed it. Records were sealed. Safety reasons. Official." "Official for what?" Larry asked, and his question sounded less like curiosity and more like the tapping of a bone. "If you want to know," said Chuck, who had wandered in to borrow a pruning shear and stayed because he hated being alone with his own thoughts, "you go to the library. They keep old maps there, the ones they don't digitize." Chuck was practical in a way Ashland Falls had once considered a virtue. He repaired things people said were unfixable. He worked with his hands, but kept his hands folded when the talk stumbled into feeling. He was the one who first said he noticed the wires, a dead line where a live one should have been, poles sagging into scrub that on modern maps simply stopped. "The grid has a seam," he told them, tapping the back of his hand against his knee, like a scar. After the meeting, the club thinned out into moist evening, and people went back to their yards. Isabel walked home and found the town smaller than she remembered. It was not only the buildings that had shrunk, but the confidence of the people walking past one another. Eyes slid away, mouths pressed into polite voids. Ashley's name had already become a quiet. People were tired of saying it. "If this is about a ghost," Bonnie said later to Isabel, when they were alone in Bonnie's living room and Bonnie's hands shook as she poured tea, "I don't want to hear about it." "Nobody wants ghosts," Isabel said, and she felt for a moment like she could carry the truth in the same way she carried the boxes from her old life. "We want answers." The library was a narrow building that smelled of old paper and lemon oil polish. It was the sort of place that had a stair that had worn a groove where feet had traced the same path for decades. Files sat like sleeping things, delicate, brittle. The librarian, a woman named Ruth, who had been a small child when the 1980 meeting happened, led them to a back room with a barred window. "You won't find everything," Ruth said, folding her hands like she was closing a drawer. "Some of it is sealed. Some of it is lost. But maps don't lie. They just remember." The map they pulled from a box was fragile enough that holding it felt like holding a secret. It was an electrical diagram from 1923, lines and numbers in ink that had faded but not surrendered their meaning. In the margins, someone had penciled a new line with a shaky hand. Someone had written "Forest Road" in a small, precise script. Isabel watched Chuck spread the map over a table, the way someone arranges a body before they start to ask questions of it. "Follow the feed," Chuck said. He traced with a fingertip, not wanting to crease more paper. "See, it runs from the substation past Maine, then it branches off. Most of it goes to houses. One leg heads out and then stops." "Where?" Maria asked. "Out here," Chuck said. He tapped an area that in the modern map was an empty patch of scrub between the old mill and a curve in the road. On the battery of his phone, he had already overlaid a satellite image. The modern lines didn't pick up the old leg. The poles disappeared. The wires simply stopped. Maybe they ripped them out. Old lines, replaced. Maybe, Chuck said, or maybe they didn't want anyone to look where they went. The council had reasons. Safety, yes, but safety covers a lot. It can cover scars. Someone at the table, Isabel couldn't remember who, pushed a scrap of yellowed council minutes across the map. The top of the paper had been blacked out, redacted until the letters formed a bristling silhouette like a hedgerow. What was left could have been bureaucratic. It read in its clipped way, "Public safety concerns necessitate closure of the property located at 825 Forest Road. Access to site sealed. Records pertaining to closure archived separately." A property? Isabel read aloud, the word heavy. The map had no house marked at the curve of the scrub. It had only a depression in the land, a place where contour lines fell inward. 825 Forest Road, Ruth said, fingers absently smoothing a stray curl of her hair. It's in the old ledger, but when they rebuilt the tax rolls in '91, that parcel was gone. The address was redrawn. The road was rerouted. It's like... She stopped. The sentence hovered. It's like someone erased a place on purpose. Maybe they built over it, Maria said. Maybe a cul-de-sac, a new housing development? Maybe, said Chuck, we drive there, see what's left. Isabel left the library with a Xerox of the map and a photocopy of the redacted minutes folded into her coat. The air in town smelled of rain, even though the sky was a clear, fat blue. When she walked past the lintel of the old textile workshop, a sound followed her. A laugh that wasn't hers, threaded with the old woman's perfume. She told herself she had imagined it. That night, Isabel dreamed of a child's hand clinging to a ledge. The hand was small and sticky with soil. A voice said her name, one syllable, soft as a river finding a rock. She woke with her fist clenched under her pillow and a taste of metal in her mouth. The dream felt like a message and a theft at the same time. Meanwhile, Maria dug through attics. Her studio was a place where things were confronted, needed, and put back together. She had a habit of bringing broken things home to see if they would speak. She found a mannequin in a storage closet behind an old gallery wall, one that no one had catalogued. Its torso was wrapped in yellowing cloth. When she propped it in the corner, it made the space feel like a room had been invaded by a presence that did not belong to living furniture. At night, the mannequin seemed to stand in the line of her lamp and regard the studio with a patience that made her chest tighten. "It's a body," she told Isabel over coffee when they met to talk, "not a person. You can place a coat over it, and it becomes a person for a minute. Then you remember it never breathed." "They say objects can remember," Isabel said, and the words startled her because they sounded like a line from a bad play, like things hold memory, books, houses, roads. "Things remember what we refuse to remember," Maria said. The sentence landed like a stone. The gardening club kept meeting, though the tea grew weaker and the talk narrower. They traded stories now like talismans, the town's formerly unexplained suicides, the lost child from Helen Foster's house, the time in the 70s when a young man wandered into the scrub and came back different. Each story brushed at something raw, and the club members looked at each other as if asking permission to touch the wound. Someone, most likely Larry, produced an old newspaper clipping tucked into a recipe book. Its headline read, "Council votes to seal property." The photograph accompanying it showed a concrete hatch, a ring bolt disappearing into the ground like an eye.
The caption said the hatch had been installed by municipal workers and that it would ensure public safety. A date beneath nodded to 1980. There was no follow-up reporting that explained what lay under the hatch. The town had swallowed the rest into silence. "Public safety," Chuck said, his voice small in the kitchen where they had gathered. "That's the language of closing doors." "Or burying things," Bonnie said. They drove out at dusk, 5 of them in 2 cars, because going alone felt like tempting the dark. Isabel rode with Maria, clutching the photocopy of the map on her lap. The scrub smelled like sap and old rain.
The power poles thinned into a single line and then, emphatically, ended. The GPS blinked and shrugged. The road curved and folded and became a track. For a moment, the town felt like a story stripped of its last page. Lunching in the weeds where the map showed a hollow, they found a driveway paved in a way that had been left to rot. The road ended at a low, square mound. Once, a house had faced the road. Now the foundation stood like teeth. Grasses grew through its ribs. A maple leaned its head as if tired. The place looked abandoned long enough to be historical. "A house here," Larry said, and there was sadness in the way he said it. "Helen's." They found a hatch near the foundation. It was a slab of poured concrete set flush with earth. Around its edge, the soil had been tamped down and then left. A rusted brass plaque was bolted into the concrete, green with age. Someone had tried to scrub the letters. The date was still legible, 1980. The plaque bore the town seal and a typed line, "Site sealed, authorized by municipal council." Nobody touched it at first. They stood in a semicircle, a small, deliberate congregation of the curious and the afraid. The late sun turned the plaque a dull coin. "If it was dangerous," Maria said in the hush, "why not tell people?" "Because transparency doesn't help when people don't want to know," Chuck said. His fingers curled tight and then relaxed. "Because if you point, you make it real." Bonnie wiped at the plaque with the hem of her sleeve. Her hand trembled. The scrape made no sound worth noting. Isabel crouched and put her palm near the rust. The ground was warm from the day's sun. "It's sealed, right? Sealed by concrete?" "Sealed by more than concrete," Larry said. "Record sealed in 1980, in case of an event, in case of—" He couldn't say, though the sentence was a cliff. "We could leave it. We could go back to town and pretend we didn't see." "Or we could look," Chuck said. The word was simple. It had the force of a tool being put into a hand. They debated without choosing. Nights in Ashland Falls had a way of moving people toward decisions they hadn't intended to make. The town itself seemed to watch and wait. Isabel kept thinking of Ashley's face, the small, heartbreaking absence that had widened into a rumor. She thought of her mother's sweater and how thin it had become at the elbows. She thought, too, of Helen Foster, a figure sewn into their histories like a seam that had never been cut away. They found signs that night, small things that did not need extraordinary explanation, but that suggested the place had been recently disturbed. A boot print pressed into mud softened by evening dew. A book, its cover nicked, lying open a few feet from the hatch. The pages were blank where the ink had faded, yet the book felt intentionally placed, as if it had been set where the wind would not scatter it. Someone said they heard a hum. At first, Isabel thought it was a passing tractor or the hiss of a distant highway. It was low. It had the quality of machinery left on standby, the kind of noise that nerves take as thought. It made the hair on her arms lift. She leaned forward, and for a moment she was sure the sound carried a note she had heard in her dream, a small, bright syllable that might have been a child's laugh. "We should mark it," Maria said, voice steady with the kind of calm that comes when someone decides they will be responsible for a thing. We should tell someone who can— Who? Larry said. The council? They already buried it. The paper? They cut their teeth on the same silence. You could go to the state, Bonnie suggested, and even as she said it, she seemed to know it was a poor choice. But then you set off a noise that can't be put back in its bottle. It was a practical fear. The town had a history of folding. Public interest made property developers sniff. Officials made decisions in the name of safety, and then, more than safety, in the name of peace. Peace, in small towns, often amounted to not rocking the boat, because the people who lived closest to the boat had no options if the boat sank. The sealed site existed in a place where legality and the old stories overlapped like two thin, translucent maps. Isabel took a photograph of the hatch with her phone, and something curious happened. The image came out with a smear across the corner, not of light, but of absence. When she looked back at the screen, the smear had the shape of a small handprint, like a kid's hand stuck to a window that had been wiped clean. She showed the picture to Maria without meaning to make a claim about the thing they were all afraid of. Maria studied it like a scientist and then lowered her head. Whoever sealed it did something else. They tried to make it unreadable. They wanted no record. Records get in the way, Chuck said. He had become, in the short span of their investigation, a keeper of neat hands and uncluttered thoughts. They needed to make sure people forgot. Not everything forgets, Isabel said, remembering the books that had reappeared in the library, the mannequin in Maria's studio, the laugh she thought she heard in the hallways of her apartment. Not everything forgets. They camped at the edge of the plot, as if proximity might alter the course of the night. Isabel couldn't sleep. Every small sound made her body alert, as if she could, by being awake, stop history from repeating. At 2 a.m., when the rest had slipped into the quiet breath of exhaustion, she heard it again. A child's yodel close by. It was lilting and wrong in a way that made the skin on her neck ripple. She went to the hatch alone, barefoot and in her pajamas, because rust and old concrete held a gravity that gravity had nothing to do with. The air was cold and smelled like wet stone. She laid her palm on the plaque.
The metal felt cool, and for a moment a memory or an echo slid under her skin. A lullaby hummed in a different century, a woman crying out in a language that might have been English and might have been memory. Isabel almost ran from the plot, but she stayed because running away felt like surrendering something she could no longer name. She pressed her ear to the concrete. The hum deepened. Under it, something like breathing or wind or the syllable of the laugh thinned and thickened. She felt pressure behind her eyes, like the way the sky feels before a storm. For a second she was sure she heard a name, tiny, urgent. She did not know whether it was a voice or the shape of a memory. She stumbled back and woke the others. "You heard it?" Chuck asked, and his voice bore the flat edge of someone trying not to believe. Isabel started. "Yes." They moved then with a civic hand. It started with measuring the plaque. Chuck found a crowbar in the trunk of his car and washed his hands of metaphor by handing it to Larry, who had always prided himself on being able to pry stubborn things open. The tool felt heavy and honest. They argued about breaking concrete for exactly 30 seconds and then broke it. The first scrap came free like a resolver, a wedge of old decision that had aged into an answering echo. Dust rose and smelled of something like leaf mold and wet iron. Underneath the slab there was not air, but a dark and the hint of a tunnel. They did not go down. Nobody in Ashland Falls had the equipment. They did not have ropes or breathing gear or any real reason to descend except curiosity and grief. But the opening was small enough to peer into. The light from their phones was dicey. Instead of darkness, the hole held a plane of black that seemed to absorb the light like a mouth. It was quieter than the night, as if the thing under the earth had learned to swallow sound. Isabel leaned forward until her nose almost touched the rim, and something brushed the inside of her skull, not with a voice, but with a history. It slid across the place a name would occupy. Mary. She tasted it like a salt. Mary, she whispered, and the word felt like a confession. A sound answered. It was not a voice so much as the idea of a voice, a pattern of exhalations mapping a child's pacing. It could have been wind in a shaft, echoing in a way the world liked to call mournful, or it could have been a memory that had set itself to breathe. Chuck said nothing. Maria wept a small, dry sob that seemed to surprise her because she did not know when she had decided to be that sad. They closed the slab back the way they found it. The concrete gritted under their palms. The town settled into a new knowledge. They drove home under a sky stitched with stars, and the town lights pulling the dark into little safe circles. Ashland Falls had its secrets again, but the seams were different, fragile, open, and humming.
That was where the first part of the story stops, where curiosity slips into responsibility and the knowledge of things changes the shape of ordinary life. People in Ashland Falls went back to their routines and found traces of the night adhered to them like lint. The books in the library shifted on the shelf as if to make room. The mannequin in Maria's studio had a scarf draped across its shoulder the next morning, though Maria was sure she had not placed it. Isabel woke with her mother's sweater in her hands and couldn't remember putting it on. Chuck found a child's shoe behind his shed that he was certain he'd never seen before. Bonnie dreamed of a woman standing at a window and could not say whether the woman was asking to come in or warning them to stay away. The town would argue about what to do. Names would be mentioned that were both practical and moral: Department of Natural Resources, State Police, Preservation Committees. People would say safety reasons and town history and public interest, as if any of those words could sew the place back to its original silence. Someone would pull up copies of the 1980 minutes and find more redactions. Someone else would overlay more maps and find more seams. The hum would be recorded on a phone that glitched the file into static. Isabel would have another dream in which Mary's fingers pull hers down into a dark, and the earth smells like the inside of a book. Until then, they sealed what had been opened, and kept awake the idea that sealing was not the same as forgetting. The hatch sat like a promise and a threat. Something, whatever the town had intended to bury, remained within reach of sound, memory, and hunger. If this kind of quiet, small-town mystery is the sort of story you like, subscribe for more. Meanwhile, the town did what it did best. It folded the event into its daily life and pretended that time had not altered it. But time had done something, and so had their unearthing. People began to notice the wrongness of ordinary things: books that returned to specific shelves on their own, a child's laugh threaded through the static of late-night radio, the power at the edges of town that hummed differently, as if tuned to a key no one could name. The next morning, the council was a rumor and a photograph. At the bakery, someone on the counter flipped through the town ledger and found the listing for 825 Forest Road excised and replaced with indefinido, where more detail had once lived. The ledger had never used that term before. It looked like someone had boxed a blank and put a bow on it. Isabel walked through the market and felt the town's attention as if it were a hand on her shoulder. People stared with the small, sharp concern that asks not how to help, but whether to judge. Maria came to her studio with clay under her fingernails and eyes like a person who had not slept. Chuck arrived at the library with a list of tools and the look of a man who thought he knew how to fix doors. Bonnie and Larry held the garden club meeting in a greenhouse that smelled of earth and sun, and they talked about seeds and precautions in the same breath. They were, all of them, knuckling their sorrow into action. It is a particular kind of courage to go looking when the thing you might find could be worse than not knowing, to pry at an old decision because silence has its own appetite. They formed plans in small, careful increments. Someone would call, someone would request copies of sealed minutes, someone would ask a friend who knew a state-level contact. They drew lines on maps with a ruler. They made lists of equipment, lights, harnesses, a camera, rope. Ashland Falls drank its coffee and then packed it into thermoses. They moved like people who believed the night had only started to tell its story. And under their feet, under the patched concrete of a hatch, something pulsed with a small, persistent life. It answered by rearranging the margins of their days. It placed a book in a house that had never owned that book. It whispered a name in a dream that would not go away. It kept to itself in ways that were cunning. It used the language of things, maps, wires, sealed minutes, to shape the town's actions. Whether it wanted to be found or wanted only to be recognized, they could not yet say. But recognition is itself a kind of proximity. Once acknowledged, something changes. At the edge of the town where the poles halt and scrub begins, the sealed place waited. The plaque rusted. The concrete held its ring bolt like an eye that would not blink. The power lines terminated without explanation, and the map contained a cut like a note torn from a book. The photograph of the councilman remained on the mantel in Bonnie's living room, its black and white seriousness the ghost of a decision that had cost the town its appetite for questions. Isabel kept the photocopy of the redacted minutes in her pocket. At night she unfolded it and smoothed the paper between her fingers, watching the blacked-out lines as if they might rearrange themselves into an explanation. They did not. But the pages were not empty. The town had put things into them, a child's laughter, a mannequin that borrowed somebody's coat, a hum that rose like a tide. These were not explanations. They were symptoms. They were echoes of whatever lay beneath. They had sealed the cave for a reason, and now, having found a seam, the town had to decide whether to follow it deeper. The decision would not be clean. It would be full of small errors, regrets, and unintentional cruelty. It would involve names and loud machinery and hands that shook when they reached for a crowbar. It would also involve a refusal to let silence continue to cocoon the town. As they planned their next steps, Isabel sat with the photocopy and wrote something on the back in the margin, a child's scrawl perhaps, or an adult's. She wrote a name she had heard in a dream and then rubbed it out. Ink smeared.
She could not tell whether she had meant to do that or whether the act felt like an offering. There is a moment in every search when you realize you are no longer looking for answers so much as you are keeping watch over what you have already found. Ashland Falls had found its hatch. It had found a seam in the map. It had heard a sound that was not quite a voice. It had not yet found the reason why the cave had been sealed. But reason and motive are luxuries compared to the immediate facts. A hole had been opened, however briefly. Something had responded. The town had survived the night. At dawn the next day, the concrete slab was whole again. No one could say with confidence who had replaced it. Some believed they had done it themselves out of fear. Some suspected someone in the council had slipped in with a shovel and the weight of official necessity. The truth, like many things in Ashland Falls, was layered, a mixture of deliberate choices and accidental coincidences. The hatch existed in many versions simultaneously: physical object, municipal artifact, secret site, and myth. Each version needed a different sort of courage to confront. They would gather evidence. They would argue about what evidence could mean when the thing they sought might not be physical in the way they understood. Maps would be overlaid until the lines looked like the veins on an old hand. Recordings would be made and then corrupted. Dreams would be catalogued and dismissed.
All of it would be human behavior layered over a place that refused to stay quiet. The first part of this story ends with the town awake and rubbed raw by the knowledge of what they have found. They have a reason to go back. They have a rip in their map. They have a dream that cannot be ignored and a photograph that refuses to be explained. They have the hollow feeling that comes when a place you thought was fixed in time begins to reveal itself as porous. Whether the thing inside the sealed cave is a memory given form, a restless child, a consequence of human cruelty, or something that will not fit any tidy category, that remains to be seen. For now, the town carries the fact of it like a bruise you press to see if it will glow. They carry it into daily life, into small, jokeless conversations, into the ways they tuck away their children at night. The cave is sealed, but their knowledge of it is not, and knowledge, once known, has a way of growing teeth. They set a date with the kind of careful brusqueness people use when they are trying to pretend an ordinary thing is still ordinary. Tools were listed on a scrap of cardboard. Headlamps, a winch, a spool of cord rescued from Chuck's garage, a GoPro that belonged to a kid who filmed skateboard tricks and now filmed secrets. They agreed on names and times, and who would call whom if someone changed their mind. The list had the taste of defiance. It was also a bargaining chip against fear. They did not invite officials. The town had already proved it could politely seal information with a stamped envelope and a photograph. Calling the council again felt like asking the people who had hidden the problem to grant them permission to undo the hiding. Instead, they relied on the same odd coalition that had formed in the aftermath of the hatch. People with a practical lack of imagination about danger. Chuck with a toolbox and a habit of fixing things. Larry, steady as a plumb line and slow to anger. Bonnie, who had learned to provide comfort for crises her own hands could not mend. Maria, who wanted to know what memory had lodged itself in materials. And Isabel, who could not keep the face of Ashley out of her head and felt that not knowing had weight. They met at dusk again, because dusk and Ashland Falls made things seem more like stories and less like choices. The sky offered the soft gray of people who had not decided whether to grieve or to sleep. They drove past the last lamppost and into the place where the poles thinned and the GPS gave up. The hatch looked smaller when you came to it the second time, as if proximity could shrink the enormity of a decision. It was, to the eye, a lid on a dark. They had a plan that was both technical and ugly. Thread a camera through a narrow shaft. If there was a chamber, they would not descend until they had better equipment. If there was nothing but earth and echoes, at least they would know. Chuck had tied a rope to the GoPro, wrapped the cord around the winch from his truck, and tested the pull. Maria had a spare blanket, as if blankets could stitch safety. Larry had a machete because the map showed scrub, and Bonnie had a thermos. Isabel carried the photocopy of the redacted minutes like a talisman. The concrete scraped under the crowbar's bite. When the cut was made, the sound was small, a fracture, and then the iron ring came free with a reluctant sigh. Dust rose and hung in the headlamps like tiny constellations. Chuck fed the camera into the dark with the mechanical patience of a man who had once dovetailed a broken table back into a kitchen. The cord unwound in a slow, measured motion. For a long moment, nothing changed except for the light turning into a dot that retreated. The town sounded far away, like something someone else was doing. At 6 feet down, the camera's light found stone, slick, black as old bones. There were scratches on the rock, thin and arranged as if someone had practiced making names. The feed shook with the echo of dropped stones. The camera rotated and the lens caught a ledge, and then, further, a vertical throat opening into a larger space. The camera's microphone picked up a low hum, too consistent to be wind, too faint for machinery in the immediate area. "We should," Bonnie started, but the words strangled to a thin sound when the feed moved and the light passed across a face drawn on the stone. A childish circle of eyes and a line for a mouth. carved with the impatient geometry of a small hand. The image fuzzed and then snapped back to darkness. Larry swore under his breath. The voice was small and animal. The team kept their hands on the rope because hands wanted to do action when their chests were full of dread. They winched the camera deeper. In the light, the shaft widened into a chamber where the walls wore things like a memory. Piles of old paper bundled with string, a rusted child's dinner plate, the suggestion of shelves carved into the stone. The stones held flecks of something that might have been paint. They were piles of books stacked on irregular ledges, their spines eaten by humidity, their covers swollen with age. One stack, in the camera's harsh LED, read as if someone had arranged the books into a figure. 3 at the base, 2 on top, 1 poised like a head. The arrangement made the light throw a shadow that for a breath looked like a small person sitting with knees drawn up. Isabel felt her throat close. She pressed her palm into the packed earth and thought of the child's drawing saved under the teapot, of Ashley's face, of all the small things that had been put away to keep people safe from looking. The camera, in its honest machine way, kept rolling. The microphone opened like a mouth and found the sound, a pattern, a fragment of melody that could have been a lullaby or a radio show or the memory of someone humming in the dark. It was not a clear voice, but a tonal sequence with the cadence of a child's breath. The feed glitched. On the screen between frames, something else showed. For a heartbeat, there was a room with wallpaper and a window and a small hand pressed to glass. The image did not match anything they knew of the interior the camera was describing. It was like a fold in time, an overlay. Isabel's stomach dropped with the sense that the cave's interior could borrow memories from elsewhere and set them like props. They reeled the camera up. The cord hummed like a plucked string. When the lens emerged into the night air, the microphone had recorded a file that, when played back, sounded like a field of static with one voice threaded through, too thin to be certain. On the playback, at a speed that was not bravery but curiosity sped with complacency, the voice resolved into syllables that might have been a name. It was not a name they could be sure of, and that made the sound more dangerous. Ambiguity demands filling, and people supply what the lack requires. "Mary," Isabel heard herself say again. She did not know how the syllable had left her mouth the first time. Now it hung between them as if it were an accusation. They debated whether to hand the file over to someone with better equipment. The temptation to call a lab, a university, a skeptic was strong. But the past had taught them that other people came with other scales. There was a difference between being careful with evidence and giving it to people whose hands would repackage the event into grants and press releases. They chose to make a backup. Larry promised to take the drive, to hide it in his workbench, to pretend it was nothing more than a tape of a faulty camera. It was a ritual of secrecy disguised as prudence. Over the following days, the town breathed with a new, anxious rhythm. Isabel found herself waking to a compost of dreams. Mary's hand tugged at her sleeve in one. In another, she was in a council chamber watching men argue about public safety and hearing the phrase as if it were a foreign language meant to excuse a crime. Maria found that the mannequin in her studio had shifted to face the door. One morning, Maria opened a box of clay and found it scored as if someone had kneaded it with a child's small fingernails. Small acts of rearrangement multiplied. A book borrowed from the library returned to the shelf with a different spine showing. A teacup that Bonnie kept in her kitchen for Sundays was found upside down, its handle pointing toward the back door. These gestures did not feel malicious. They felt like messages left in a language people had forgotten. The town's response split into a private arithmetic. Some lived as if the cave were a rumor. Others treated the cave as a hazard that required barricades and signs. The more pragmatic rose. A woman from the County Historical Society called, having heard rumor of rumor. She wanted a meeting to look at minutes, to discuss whether the council minutes could be unredacted under open records. Her voice on the phone was procedural and competent. Her competence felt like the wrong kind of light. People had already seen how the town's official side closed like the lid of a box. Still, a thread of hope unspooled. If someone could unseal the records, then the sealing could be examined. The county woman was patient, but also careful to avoid alarm. Records become redacted for a number of reasons, she said. Sometimes it's safety. Sometimes it's the way paperwork was handled in a time when you— and there she bit the sentence off, the meaning floating. We handled things differently. She requested copies. The paperwork that came back was heavy with bureaucratic language and thin on explanation, with a blotch of stamped red marks over a paragraph that might have contained the clearest sentence. They filed an appeal. The council minutes were the kind of thing that invited conspiracy because they were deliberately uninformative. They confirmed the decision and confirmed less detail than the town had demanded. In a public meeting, the councilwoman who had signed the order, by then an elderly figure who kept a tidy yard and rarely left her house, was asked to speak. She gave them a short, precise statement that offered no confession. We responded to a need for safety.
Records are sealed to protect essential infrastructure and to avoid panic. Some details remain undefined in public ledgers for reasons of privacy and utility. Isabel listened to the broadcast of the meeting on the local station and felt a new kind of rage. Not the hot flare of instantaneous anger, but the slow burn of a community being translated into neutral phrases: safety, privacy, utility. It was as if the words themselves were a mortar made to hold a lid in place. Driving back from the meeting, Maria turned the radio to static and let the hiss fill the car. She said, with a clarity that made Isabel look over, "They treated a memory like a hazard. You can't make a decision about a wound without feeling it. They sealed a wound, but a sealed wound can fester. It changes you." Chuck, who had once been content to fix leaking valves and creaky floorboards, began to pay attention to the infrastructure thread that had first led them out of town. He spent his mornings tracing lines that were not meant to be traced, standing in green fields, listening for the hum of current, and walking along poles that sprouted like recalcitrant teeth. In the space where the grid stopped, someone had left a piece of history, an old transformer with its shell punctured and eaten by rust. Around it, the weeds had grown as if to create a halo. Sometimes, when there was low sun, the transformer hummed with a noise that made the back of Chuck's neck prickle. It was not active on any meter, but it had an electrical quality, a low frequency that the body recognizes long before the mind assigns meaning. "Call it superstition," Chuck said once, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug he'd left for himself when he meant to make decisions. "But some systems keep memory. Copper carries a story. Old wire can hold a residue of what it carried. Not like a ghost story, the physics is different. But I can't ignore that the wire stops here and something below it continues." The wire had become a metaphor and, dangerously, a map. If there was a source of power, whether electrical, psychological, or something else, it seemed likely to be aligned with the seam they had found. They tried to add a scientific veneer to their curiosity without letting it smother the human aspects. A friend of Larry's who taught geology at a nearby college agreed to lend a seismograph. Another associate had a thermal camera that they could rent for a day. Equipment, they knew, would not offer explanation, but devices would force the cave to present itself in particulars, and that, they hoped, might make the intangible manageable. On a gray Wednesday, clouds handing low as if overheard, they reconvened with instruments. The thermal camera found nothing like heat at the hatch. The seismographs picked up a pattern inconsistent with foot traffic, a series of faint, regular thumps that might have been settling rock or might have been something repeating with a pattern too deliberate to be random.
The devices recorded the hum they had heard and translated it into lines on a screen that quivered like a heartbeat. They tried to lower the GoPro again, this time with a different microphone and a light with less wash. The camera's viewfinder offered them a faithful eye. The chamber's walls were mottled, the shelves more numerous than first seen, and the book stacks arranged in a slow spiral down into the earth. A child's plate sat on one stone like a small moon. On another ledge, a doll's shoe, 2 sizes smaller than the shoe Chuck had found behind his shed, sat waiting. The new audio picked up something that the last device had not, the pattern of inhalations, breath that rose and fell with a rhythm like sleep. The recorder translated the pattern into a wave that, when slowed, sounded like a lullaby hummed at the edge of hearing. When they played it back sped up, there were syllables in the hum that suggested words in a language none of them could comfortably place. The lack of legibility made people supply their own meanings. "We should not be here," Bonnie said, not because she feared the dark, but because startling the unknown felt like a moral quandary. If Mary's here, and if they're here, who are we to pull at them? "Isn't that what we're doing by leaving it?" Isabel replied. Her voice was thin with the strain of having held grief like a knot. "Leaving it is doing something too. Mere not looking is an act." The moral debate had no resolution that satisfied everyone. They argued, as townspeople do, in fragments and with backhanded politeness. They appealed to each other's vulnerabilities as evidence for courage. In the background, the GoPro kept showing the chamber, and the camera thread blinked like a vein under skin. One night, they lowered a different instrument altogether, a phone with an app that allowed them to record at high sample rates and to attempt to isolate frequencies humans don't hear. It was a clumsy gadget, and they knew it, but it captured a richness the other microphones missed. When they played it back, slowed in increments, a phrase popped through, a whispered set of vowels that broke their arrangement of caution. It was a cadence as intimate as being called at dawn by someone who remembers the original name you were given before the world taught you an adult name. Librarians, geologists, and a county historian gathered around the sound file. People who had once made copies of minutes for a living clustered like conspirators. The audio looked like a contour on the screen and like a poem when slowed to a child's speed. Under the fossil of the noise was a pattern that suggested repetition, a small set of syllables said over and over, like counting, like pacing, like someone marking time in the dark. "They marked time," Maria said. "Someone waited down there." "Why?" Isabel asked, and it was not a rhetorical question. The answer they could not conjure. The sealed minutes might have meant to protect.
The council might have responded to a real hazard, or perhaps the town had used physical sealing as a way to contain a memory so dangerous they could not confront it publicly. The possibilities were not reassuring. The more evidence they collected, the more the town's seams began to open in unlikely places. The bakery, where the woman who baked scones listened in and closed early for a spell because she kept dreaming of a woman at a window. Kids on bicycles began to tell a story about a tree near the scrub that, when leaned against, felt as if a person on the other side of the bark sighed. The pattern of collective attention is like weather. A little rain begets moss, and moss changes what lives there. A reporter from the regional paper came, bright-eyed and polite, and asked questions people found awkwardly invasive. She framed the story like a crime. What did they hide? That phrasing felt like a blade. People who lived with the thing in their bones did not want to be told their past in headlines. The reporter left with recordings and a notebook full of quotations that could be cobbled into a narrative. She also left with the awareness that some towns keep their wounds close. Then, one afternoon, when the light had the brittle quality of an old photograph, Isabel woke to a call from Chuck that shook the small apartment where her mother's perfume still felt like a claim. He did not speak in the casual tones he used for small repairs. "She answered," he said, "on the recorder." He explained that he had run the audio through a slow resonance filter just to test an idea. Small things can hide in frequency. When slowed drastically, the pattern of hum resolved into a phrase clearer than before, a name precisely formed. The file, when he had slowed it, seemed to contain a voice that said, between breaths, "Mom." Isabel's body moved before her mind could decide. She went to the library, to the place where Ruth shelved maps like relics. Ruth met her at the door with the posture of someone who had been expecting to be called and judged in equal measure. Isabel explained, and Ruth, who had been a child in 1980, did not need the technical description to understand that something in the past was returning an echo with a cruelty that felt intimate. "Sometimes," Ruth said, "you get a voice, and you hear not what is being said, but what you want to believe it says. You hear Mom, and the thing under the ground borrows the weight of your loss to touch you." Isabel could not decide if Ruth was warning or explaining. She thought of Ashley, of the quiet graves, of the way mourning bends a community into whispers. She knew that sound could be weapon or balm. It could soothe or it could rend. In a house where grief was a family heirloom, the sound of Mom was both a beacon and a trap. They agreed to a constrained experiment. They would attempt to lower a small microphone into the chamber and retrieve the file. They would not unseal more than necessary. They would not make a spectacle. They would stay in daylight hours. They would create a log of each step. These were rituals meant to move them from panic to process. The deployment went as planned until it did not. The microphone hit a ledge and the line went taut. Chuck tugged and felt an unexpected resistance, like something cupped the cable. He gave a measured pull, and the cable surged free with a dampened sound like a sob. When they reeled the line in, the microphone was smeared with a fine powder that smelled of iron and old paper. On playback, the recording contained the pattern of breath and then a phrase that was not the child's voice, but rather layered voices, one over another, like a chorus assembled from years. "Listen," Larry said. He played it, and the room filled with a quiet that felt like a tension. Through the speakers came a chorus of small intonations, a high childish pitch repeating a single syllable, undercut by a lower sound that might have been a woman's voice humming. Beneath the human register was an undertone that vibrated in the bones. It was not music any of them recognized, and yet it carried the shape of lullabies. Within the chorus there was a cadence that made Isabel imagine a small person counting rocks or arranging books. When the sound peaked, something staggered in the library. A vase trembled on a shelf, though there had been no draft. "It knows we're listening," Maria whispered. Her voice was a thread stretched thin. The idea was too rational to feel like comfort. Directed attention implies intelligence, or at least an agency adept at patterning. After the library, normality retreated on small measures. Isabel found herself unable to shake the feeling of being observed by an old, patient thing that had learned to speak in half-lies. She woke more nights than not with the taste of dust in the back of her throat and a sense that something had brushed the back of her hands in sleep. Maria began to sketch designs that were not for galleries, but for barricades, shelves that would hold books in ways that might keep them from rearranging themselves. Chuck started leaving a radio tuned to a static station running through the night, as if noise could confuse whatever attention lived in the earth. Then, one afternoon that began as every other, the town was faced with the kind of accident that makes one wonder whether the world favors accidents or orchestrations. A small child, the son of a woman who worked nights at the hospital, wandered toward the scrub with his bicycle. He was gone for 30 minutes. People described a ghostly sighting. He had been at the edge of the field, staring at the hatch with a look that felt like reverence. When he was found, he said only that he had been listening to a woman calling him.
He could not say where the woman came from or whether she had been in the ground.
The town held its breath. The mother asked the boy if he wanted to talk, and he shrugged with the easy indifference of a child who had seen a thing and decided not to make a story of it. The incident tightened the threads of caution. Parents started keeping children home. The paper, smelling blood like hungry vultures, ran a short, careful piece about unexplained incidents near marked municipal property. The tone was proper, but the subtext of curiosity spread like varnish. The council, miles away in its linened offices, announced an investigation. The town had to reckon with the fact that the thing they'd found, or had found them, demanded a response from people with jurisdiction and power. At the same time, their own impulses grew bolder. They were better at small personal acts than at bureaucratic processes. They were friends and acquaintances who understood each other's limits. Isabel could not wait for a committee to assemble. She could not bear the thought that a bureaucrat might see the child's face the way people see numbers. She and Maria and Chuck and Larry and Bonnie decided they would go in pairs, not as a mob, but as witnesses. If they were going to open a mouth in the ground, they wanted to do it in daylight and with measure. On the day they chose, the sky was clear in a way that made the scrub look like a stage. They came with harnesses borrowed from a climbing group, with a winch borrowed from a contractor who had sympathetic eyes and a reluctance to be involved in what sounded like superstition. They came with nitrile-lined camera, with a battery pack, with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. They came because humans are stubborn in the face of not knowing, and because curiosity sometimes functions as a form of grief. They broke the seal again. This time they aimed to peer and then repair. The lid was heavy, but human resolve is a particular kind of machine. It moved it with the communal strength of people determined to make the past visible. They lowered a person whose job was only to steady the equipment. They did not descend. The plan had been carefully calibrated. Eyes in the hole, data gathered, retreat. At 4 meters, the rope snagged. It jolted with a force like a child pulling at an adult's hand. The winch screamed and then stilled. The man who steadied the line felt a coldness pass through his gloves and into his palm, as if the rope had run through water. Isabel struck a match and held it to the edge of the shaft, because flame can sometimes show the texture of what hides beyond light. The match made the dark star briefly, and with it appeared an alley of small things laid out, a row of discarded shoes, a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth, the edge of what might once have been a child's quilt. The person who peered into the hole inhaled and then let out a sound that was not a shout, but a breaking.
He had seen a room that repeated across time. Wallpaper with floral prints from different decades overlaid like palimpsest, a chair with stuffing erupting, and at the far edge, a figure who was small enough to crouch and who was also as still as a statue carved from memory. The figure turned its head, and for an instant the eye caught the matchlight and flashed, not with the cold reflective flash of stone, but with something that felt alive and melancholy. "Do you see it?" Isabel asked, but the person could not answer. His face had gone somewhere else, into a place of recognition that looked like forgiveness and accusation braided together. He stuttered and then shook his head. "There's a child," he said, "not alive like we are alive like a memory that decided to sit up." It was, by every measure, the moment that divided people. Some felt called to leave the hatch alone, to cover it sooner and to return to the safety of ignorance. Others felt a responsibility, a moral obligation to intervene for whatever had been left down there, whether it was a historical tragedy or a living suffering that defied the categories the world taught them to use. Isabel thought of Ashley. She thought of the names on gravestones. She thought of how secrecy has ethics of its own that often prioritize the convenient over the humane. They argued. The argument was not new, and yet it carried a fierceness that surprised them all. Larry, who had always been steady, insisted they reseal the hatch and call the county. He argued from the perspective of harm reduction. We are not equipped for this. Bonnie wanted to call the priest and the doctor and anyone who could immunize them from the moral hazard. Maria gave a speech that had nothing to do with machinery and everything to do with dignity. If what's down there is a child, if it is the afterimage of a child, we cannot treat it like a hazard sign to be clipped and filed. The moral tone of the night was not resolved by words, it was resolved by action, as it often is in towns where people do not have the luxury of delegating grief to institutions. Isabel, whose resolve had hardened like a callus over the months, made the decision with the toddler logic of someone who has been awake too long. She would try to touch what she could reach and ask a simple question. If the cave answered, she would have to live with that answer in a way the town could not magistrate. She leaned toward the opening. The air that came up was cold and smelled of clay and something sweetly rotten, old paper, and the caramel smell of something like microbe-laced honey. She felt her eyes sting. She extended a gloved hand into the hole until her fingers brushed stone. The touch was not met by anything grabbing her, but the stone under her fingertips vibrated with the hum they had been tracking for weeks. It thrummed like a living thing. A voice, if it could be called that, reached through the stone, not heard, but known.
It did not press itself into her ear as a sound. It pressed itself into the hollows behind her thoughts. Images unspooled. A small child with a freckled nose, trailing a string of beads. A woman humming a song in a kitchen. A door closing in an old house like the click of a throat going silent. Isabel felt a pressure behind her eyes, like a recorded phrase trying to say itself. For a second, she was not in the field. She was in a room full of light and the smell of boiled sugar. She saw a child's hand reach for hers, and the touch felt like forgiveness and accusation at once. She stumbled backward and fell into Bonnie, who held her as if she would crack. Isabel's knees hit the ground. Her breath came sharp and flat. She had touched something that did not intend harm in the way a human can intend it, but that nevertheless eluded human categories. It was like being touched by a wound. You understood the force and also the impossibility of giving it the neat label you wanted. Maria sat with shaking hands and made no move to be useful. Chuck, who had always been competent in measurable tasks, found himself fumbling with rope like a man who had abruptly lost the math for gravity. Larry went to the car and sat with the engine idling. The group had accessed an intimacy with the past that could not be undone. They had broken a municipal lid and found history staring back with a small, stubborn intelligence. After the initial shock, the practical details returned. They covered the hatch again, more carefully. They recorded who had been there and what they had seen. They did not call the press. Someone had the sense to call a crisis line for Isabel, not because she'd done anything self-harming, but because the shape of what she had experienced required care that was not merely social. Being attended to became, in the small-town mode, a communal action. People shared bread and sat with one another and admitted to fears they had previously kept as private currency. The next days felt like the inside of a held breath. The town, for all its attempts at ordinary life, had shifted. There were more people at the library. The garden club met and said nothing for long stretches. When they spoke in practical sentences about who would keep a watch and who would take notes for an eventual official request. Someone suggested a municipal panel. Someone else muttered that panels often mean postponement. They did not have the money or the equipment to mount a full excavation with professionals. That possibility faded into a dream like other impractical benevolences. A university team with lights and permits.
engineers who could erect scaffolding and bring cameras that would not die. A friend called who had news. A university had offered to send a student with a thermal imager, but only if they had written permission to access private property. Property, again, the legal language, the habit of turning memory into a ledger line.
The town debated consent and ownership. Who had the right to decide the fate of whatever lived under their feet? If the cave had once been the place where something awful happened by human hands, did the town own the moral duty to make amends? If the cave contained a force not easily named, insistence, a memory shaped into presence, did anyone have the tools to help or heal it? While they debated, the cave continued to speak in small ways. A stack of books appeared on Ruth's doorstep with a ribbon tied in a precise knot. The ribbon was the yellowed thread of a hospital tourniquet, a detail that was two things at once. It was both simpler than what they imagined and also horrifically suggestive. Someone placed a child's drawing on the library floor under the card catalog. It was not there in the morning. A radio at Bonnie's house began to emit, late at night, a pattern of notes that matched, when identified in a list, the harmony of a lullaby Maria's grandmother used to hum before Maria's mother passed away. The town began to find that the cave did not need the hatch to reach them. It reached by suggestion, by memory, by objects sending themselves on errands. The presence changed some people in ways that were not strictly supernatural. Grief, after all, is one of the more efficient ways a life can change shape. Isabel found that she was less irritable with small things. She was simultaneously more prone to startle. Maria withdrew into clay with a hunger to model openings in mouths. Bonnie began to place an extra teacup in the cupboard as if her ritual of hospitality might be a distraction for whatever listened. Chuck started sleeping with the radio on low, a hum like white noise to argue with the cave's notes. In spite of the small domestic adjustments, the town could not be held indefinitely in the present of a lid. Press interest grew like mold. The regional reporter returned, this time with a photographer who took a photograph of the hatch from the angle of pity. For sensationalist reasons, the paper could have turned the story into a horror column and been done. Instead, the journalist wrote with the cautious curiosity of someone who had watched grief in dozens of towns and recognized the same signs. Secrecy layered with civic utility and the human appetite to tidy away uncomfortable things. The article circulated, and people who had grown up in Ashland Falls but now lived elsewhere read the paragraphs with varying degrees of annoyance and nostalgia. A few folks came back to town with the intention of attending a meeting, insisting that the cave must be dealt with using sufficient protocol to justify both curiosity and caution. It was the kind of visitor that prompted the council to take action. For the first time in a generation, the municipal meeting was full. Cameras and phones recorded corners of the room. Words like transparency and safety were traded like tokens.
An elderly councilwoman who had been present in 1980 was there, stoic and small-backed. A state official arrived with measured steps and an office's worth of forms. The night smelled of coffee and paper and the anxious sort of hope that administrative attention brings. At the microphone, the elderly councilwoman told the version of the story she had felt able to tell. Her words were careful. She spoke of the town's decision to seal the site in 1980, of records that had been redacted to protect public safety, and of the town's intention to preserve order. She neither offered confession nor deflection. She said, finally, in a voice that cracked not because she wanted to be dramatic, but because memory makes the throat vulnerable, "We made a decision. At the time, we thought it was the safest thing for our children and our town. If we were wrong," she did not finish, because ending a sentence would have required naming a failure so deep it might open more than the town wished.
Someone in the crowd asked for an unredacted copy of the 1980 minutes to be released. There was a procedural pause, because there were rules, and because rules have teeth. The votes went to procedure, and then to committees. People left the room in groups. The mood outside the town hall was different, as people filed and clustered on porches in tight knots. Some spoke of the need to bring in experts. Others said the town needed to bury the thing, that exposure would only escalate the danger. The decision that followed was made with the kind of compromise that leaves everyone dissatisfied. The hatch would remain sealed, but the town would allow a small team, 2 county officials, an archaeologist with a cautious CV, and a psychological services liaison, to survey the site and to recommend further steps. The team would be given the recordings Chuck had made. They would be asked to consider the cave as both a site of heritage and a potential hazard. The council could give the town hope, moderate, procedural hope that would not commit the municipal purse to excavation, and they would also buy time. When the team arrived, their language was the language of professionals who had seen oddities before and who kept their imagination tethered to evidence. The archaeologist, thin, patient, polite, took magnetometer readings and said words like anomaly and stratigraphy. He asked to bring in a small robot camera with extended battery life. Isabel watched the anthropologist's gloves touch the hatch like a professional hand touching a relic. The county official was rigid with the seriousness of liability. The psychological services liaison spoke quietly about shared trauma and the ethics of exposing a community to its past. They lowered the robot camera. It moved with a slow, non-human curiosity and held a light that did not wash out the stone's texture.
The feed showed the chamber in a resolution no phone could manage. The carvings on the stone were deeper than they'd first appeared. The shelves had been made by a person with a steady hand. The child's drawings on the walls were executed by different hands and different eras. Some drawings were traced in soot and some in paint. There were names carved with different tools, some hurried, some deliberative. At the bottom of a pile of books the robot camera found, pressed between 2 stones, a small leather-bound journal, swollen with damp. When the archaeologist reached for the journal, his gloved fingers hesitated because taking artifacts from a context disturbs the story they tell. He handled it carefully and then, with the consent of the county official, unwrapped it. Inside were pages written tight in a hand that leaned and then steadied. Dates were smudged, names were legible in fits. One page facing them had a child's handwriting, big letters, slanted and sure, spelling out a list of chores and a name at the bottom. The name was Mary. The archaeologist's face shifted. He asked for a pause to consult with the county office. The robot camera's feed was paused and then saved, designated not for immediate release, but for study. If there was a way to approach the thing scientifically, this was an honest attempt. The presence of a child's diary, layered with artifacts of other eras, suggested that the site had been used across generations. It also suggested that the sealing in 1980 had been done over an accumulation of small tragedies and not over a single easily named event. The findings were presented to the town in a meeting held outdoors at the library lawn because indoors had become too charged. The archaeologist spoke softly about context and dignity. He said that taking artifacts would require conserving them, and that conservation meant slow, methodical work that would likely require outside funding. The psychological liaison advised caution in sharing the artifacts with the public. The man explained that exposure to certain images and sounds could re-traumatize people who had already been touched by the site's history. "That doesn't tell us what to do," someone said from the crowd. The question was blunt and true in a way that made the professional's measured words bloom into the terrain of public argument. Should they excavate fully? Should they bury it deeper? Should they call in more equipment?
The town had to decide whether to be the caretakers of the risk or to pass the responsibility to people with licenses and budgets. The decision, finally, was a patchwork, a partial excavation and removal for conservation of what the archaeologist considered the most vulnerable items, letters, the small journal, while the main structure remained sealed. The county would keep the items in a secure facility and begin to page through the fragile pages.
The town would be kept informed, though not every detail would be public for the reasons the liaison explained gently. Exposure can be a harm. The arrangement left unanswered the largest moral question. Was it better to know the entire truth of what had occurred, or to keep some things private to preserve the community? The artifacts they removed told in fragments the anatomy of a human mess. Letters with breathless pen strokes spoke of debts and sickness, and of someone named Helen arguing about people who had pushed her family into ruin. There were entries that suggested neglect and slanted toward tragedy without explicit violence. A supply list mentioned milk and coal and a child's name. There was nothing like a neat confession. There were, instead, pieces of living, lists, a child's shorthand, a hymn line written in the margins, snatches of texture that created a composite portrait of want and attention. The study ruled out simple answers. There was evidence of long-term domestic use. There were signs of attempts to hide or to keep things under wraps across different periods. The redactions in 1980 now looked less like a single bureaucratic panic and more like one more layer added to a long pattern of community silence. The county summary noted that there were social and economic forces at work in Ashland Falls through the 20th century that could not be excised with a single administrative action. They recommended continuing to preserve the items and engaging with mental health professionals to support a community that was experiencing an emotional contagion of memory. The official pageant of expertise could not, however, quite account for the way the cave had reached beyond itself to rearrange books and to hum lullabies into radios. The town took the recommendations and stitched them into a ragged plan. The artifacts were archived in a climate-controlled facility. Funding was applied for to consider a full archaeological dig. Counseling was offered to those who had been most affected, Isabel among them, though therapy felt like a strange tool for practices that had lived in families for generations without the label of trauma attached. For every professional intervention, there remained the quieter, informal caretaking, the bringing of casseroles, the listening at kitchen tables, the sitting in porches while nights were watched. The presence persisted in small ways. A book would appear on someone's doorstep, a lullaby hummed through insulation at 2 a.m., a child's shoe turned up in the gutter, though the thoroughfare had been swept that morning. People who had been convinced they'd seen the shape of the child in the camera feed spoke of a softened guilt that clung to them like lint. The line between artifact and haunt grew porous because people kept combining the two. Months passed. The town learned to live with a kind of knowledge that could not be easily packaged.
Ashley's grave got flowers more regularly than it had before. People left extra bread at Bonnie's house for anyone who came hungry. The gardening club instituted a small memorial, a patch of daisies along the road leading out to the hatch, as if a trail of living things could anchor a hazard that had no obvious resolution. Isabel found that her nights were long and that her days filled with an ache that was sometimes mistaken by acquaintances for a heroic stoicism. She continued to go to the library and to the studio, carried the county's summaries like talismans and like burdens. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the scrub and listen until the hum melted into the birdsong. On certain evenings the hum was more pronounced, like distant machinery under skin. On rarer nights the hum seemed to quiet, as if someone under the ground had shifted position and decided to sleep. Then, one evening, when the town had mostly put the day's cares to bed, a neighbor called because in the light of his living room a stack of books had appeared and formed an image. He described the books' arrangement with exactness. They had been piled in a pattern that matched the way Maria sometimes stacked clay, an accidental echo of the camera's shadow from months earlier. The neighbor had placed his hand on the books and felt a pressure in his chest, like someone tapping for attention. He left them there and went to bed, trembling. They called the camera team. When the group arrived, they noticed that each book in the pile had been chosen with knowledge, as if someone working from the inside had known what a person would call on the shelf. Children's picture books, a primer on electrical wiring, a general interest volume about local flora, and a small medical manual with notes in the margins. On the inner side of the top book, folded like a small flag, was a page cut from a journal. On the page someone had written in a child's angular print, "Do not forget, Mary." The appearance was not a spectacle staged for the press. It was intimate, trenchant, stripped of flourish. Even those who had long defended the procedural response felt old guilt press against their ribs. The books were not cruel. They were pleading in a way that people cannot rationalize away. A neighbor who had been at the council meeting in 1980, one of the men in the photograph, now stooped and small, told them with a voice that had been used to speaking in small parishes and at long tables that the town had been guilty of a civic delusion. If you bury an event like a broken plate, you have not mended the household. The books and the page suggested something the archaeologist had hinted at. The cave was not merely a pocket of haunting, but a repository of community memory. It kept things people had tried to hide and then returned them to the world in ways that demanded attention. The pile's message, "Do not forget, Mary," became a kind of summons.
The last act of the story was not accompanied by a ritual of answers. There was no grand excavation that pulled the whole of history into daylight. Instead, in the space where terror and tenderness meet, the town made a decision that was both small and irrevocable. They would not pretend to have the full authority to heal what the past had done. They would be watchful. They would be truthful about their limitations. The council voted to place a modest plaque near the scrub, describing the site as a memorial to those who had been forgotten and as a caution about secrecy. The wording was painfully polite, "in memory of those lost," but the plaque was a start. The county agreed to keep the artifacts and to allow for community access in strict sessions where items could be viewed with contextual support. For Isabel, the plaque mattered less than the fact of being allowed to speak. People in the town started telling their versions, small confessions that felt like acts of courage. A grandfather who had visited the site in youth and pretended not to notice a child's toy. A woman who had known Helen and chosen silence because secrecy preserved the living from scorn. The collective weight of these confessions smoothed something like an edge from the town's history. It did not fix anything, it simply adjusted the moral landscape. Yet the cave's hum persisted. It had been sealed for a reason, evidently to keep something uncertain from becoming a public hazard, and that sealing had not erased what it contained. The thing inside seemed to have learned that it could not simply be excavated and boxed. It had a way of asserting its presence by making small, stubborn claims on the lives above. The artifacts, the rearranged books, and the lullabies through radios were not signs of a theatrical entity, but of a memory that had agency in the way it rearranged the margins of people's days. Months became seasons. The daisies by the road grew and were tended. The council held to its promises with the fitful attention of institutions. Some visitors came to the town and left with notes and hypotheses and the desire to make a story of the place. They forgot, as visitors do, that towns are made of consequence, not only of curiosity. Isabel found herself returning to the hatch sometimes, alone, because solitude makes certain chores bearable, paying small respects, bringing a stone carved with a child's initial, whispering a name into the air like a prayer without dogma.
She had become a small custodian of an irresolvable history. One night she pressed her hand to the cool metal of the plaque and listened. The hum, which had been a background drone for so long, felt different, less like a wire and more like a voice that had learned to hold back and to speak only when someone leaned close. "Why here?" she asked, though the question felt silly. The answer had never been a place, but a sequence of human behaviors and pressures.
Towns rearrange boundaries to hide things. Infrastructure gets repurposed so memories have a place to live. People name reasons and then file them away into ledgers that avoid human detail. The sealing of the cave had been an act of civic hygiene. It was also, in some perverse way, a human attempt at mercy. Mercy that had the side effect of turning pain into a pressing thing. Behind her, the town slept or watched or pretended to, and the hatch remained as it always had, a place of decision and a reminder. They had sealed the cave for a reason. The reason held whatever it held, memory, suffering, the residues of choices, and it would not be entirely inaccessible because memory will not be completely contained by concrete. It found ways out. Isabel stood and walked away. The plaque glinted in the last light. The power lines faded into scrub like an unanswered question. In the distance, the hum found a cadence that might once have been a child's counting. In her,